Okay, now I'm on. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to, there's 2 sessions after this. We are almost there. We're almost done with the conference. Who here stuck around and was here last night for karaoke and all of the bands and fun stuff? Quite a few people? Excellent. So I've spoken at a couple of conferences, but somehow I have still not learnt that karaoke the night before a talk is not generally a great idea. But I currently still have my voice, so as long as I can make it the next hour, I feel like we should be good. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Amy. I have come all the way from Australia to join you all here today. I love getting to travel to different places and getting to meet different people and talk about things that I'm excited about and I'm passionate about. And I'm really excited to be back here. I was in Copenhagen last year and I had an amazing time, even though it was raining and really humid and gross. And so I'm very excited that the weather's a little bit nicer here today, especially when we have the opportunity to go outside where there's a breeze and you can breathe a little bit easier. So that's always really nice. Today I'm here to talk about CSS. Now, this session is going to work a little bit differently. My plan for this was I've got Friday after lunch, so everybody's ready for a nap. Everybody's ready to go to sleep. And we've got some people in the deck chairs and the bean bags. They are already well and truly set up for that. So I thought, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to make a nice live coding experience, and we can be a little bit interactive and a little bit fun and wake everybody up for the last few sessions. So I had that all worked out. And then, has anyone tried to connect to the Wi-Fi today? Yeah. We have better internet than this in Australia. So today I have used my very expensive roaming hotspot to move my fun interactive live coding demos to slides, and we're going to go through them. If we have some time at the end, because it takes me way less time to talk through code than to write it, we might be able to see if we can fit a few fun ones in. So let's get started. What's new with CSS? Yes, CSS has changed. I get this a lot. I get quite a few comments on YouTube videos of talks I give that CSS is exactly the same as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Nothing else is different. And so I'm here to tell those people that CSS has changed. There is a whole lot going on, and I want to talk about some new CSS. Now, when I tried to work out what I would consider new, I decided that anything that has come available in one or more browsers since the start of March 2020 is probably new. Because some point around then we got distracted by a lot of things and we stopped having the mental capacity to look at what was changing. So anything that has come out in a browser since March 2020, I am considering new for the case of this talk today. I'm going to start off with a nice fun one, nesting, native CSS nesting. Anyone here familiar with CSS nesting? Anybody here use a preprocessor like Sass or Less or something else because nesting makes it way easier? It's native in CSS now, and I am super excited for that because now I can go through and I can write my CSS, I can nest everything in together, and it will still render out to the long form version when it's interpreted by the browser, but I can go through and it's way, way faster to write CSS now. So that's always fun to do. We also don't need to use the @ symbol anymore. When this first started being implemented, sorry, not @ ampersand. When this first started being implemented, we used the ampersand symbol to let it know that it was inheriting a previous section. We don't need to use that anymore for most of the time. we can just go through and write it without it. There are still a couple of times where we need to go through and use the ampersand. For example, if we're wanting to compound selectors, so in this case, ul.tags, any unordered list with a class of tags, we can use the ampersand to join them together rather than nesting them. So we still have to use them in a couple of cases, but it's much easier to go through and do it now. We can also append using the ampersand rather than prepending. So if I want to, say for example, have different styles to cards that exist inside of a feed, I can do that all in one go rather than having to write a separate, less specific CSS selector to make things easier for myself. So this one's pretty cool. Next, pseudo-selectors. We have quite a few new pseudo-selectors. Some of them I haven't used too much, and some of them I have used a lot of. Has, I want to talk a little bit more about in a minute. That one I'm super excited for. The has selector is about as close as we can get to a parent selector, so that's really exciting. From what I've been able to tell, is and where a lot of the times could be used, not necessarily interchangeably, but you could use one or the other depending on the use case. And these are really great for if you want to grab from a list of possible selectors, but without necessarily increasing the specificity. Now, I know specificity is something that can cause a lot of issues when it comes to CSS, so it is nice to be able to write some CSS selectors without making things unnecessarily specific. So is and where. Not has been around for a little bit longer than the others. This one's got a little bit less browser support, and as the name suggests, not allows us to check if a CSS selector isn't being met. So that one's really useful to be able to make sure that a class doesn't exist or a thing isn't a certain element, or if a state isn't being met, which we'll look at in a little bit. The has selector, as I said, is one of my favorite ones and is available in all browsers now as well. It came out in Firefox last year, so very excited to be using that one. Has selectors allow us to do a lot of really cool things like count how many of a particular element exist inside of a parent. In this case, I have two blocks, and the blocks have lists, and the lists have an unidentified number of items. Yes, you can count them on there. Yes, you can currently see that. But the idea is you can have an unidentified number of items. Using the has selector, we can go through and count. If a block has a list which has a list item that is the second child, we know there's obviously going to be at least two of the list items. If it has a list item that is a third child, there's going to be at least three. If a list item is the fourth child, there's going to be at least four, and so on and so forth. We can go through and count how many items, and I can assign this to a CSS variable, and then I can go through and set that CSS variable to exist inside of my span. I can also double check, because if there's only one, I just want it to say one item. I want to hide my S, my plural span. And if there's more than one, then I want to display that one. I can also go through and check for some really fun things, like whether or not a form input has been checked, if it's been ticked. Say, for example, I have a terms and conditions box. I can check, does this div contain a conditions box that is checked? If not, I can display my error, and I can make it look very angry about the fact that I have not yet agreed to the terms and conditions. So as we can see, when the box is checked, it will show and hide the angry error, and depending on how many items exist in my list, I can go through and change how many items there are. So all of these are things that we can do with the CSS has selector, and it's worth having a play around with what we're able to do and whether there's anything funky that any funky problems that this can help you solve. One thing I will note is going through and counting items like this is where having a preprocessor or something is very useful, because writing out a number of individual checks for children can take quite a while to do. So there are still definitely cases where it's useful to be able to program going through and doing it. Next, I want to have a look at color schemes. Who here loves using dark mode? Who here likes using light mode? Who here likes using light mode but didn't want to admit it because for some reason we've decided that's inferior, and it's a perfectly valid choice for a number of reasons? Thanks, Ben. Made everybody else feel more comfortable about it. Whether or not we use light or dark mode is a legitimate choice based on a number of criteria. For example, I love using dark mode, but as soon as I have glare on my screen, that becomes an issue. So sometimes we want to be able to go through and change things. I have a whole bunch of boxes here. These have various different themes. One has a dark color scheme, the other one has a light color scheme. Another one will check what my computer has said, and it will respect that choice. And another one will respect a choice based on a toggle that exists on the page. Anybody built something like this before, where you got to go through and do it? Yeah. So one of the ways that we'll often do it is adding a class and going through and checking, does the light class exist, does the dark class exist? And we can go through and change the theme. There is a new CSS property called color scheme, where we can go through and define the color scheme that exists inside of a certain element. We can tell it this element should have a light color scheme, this element should have a dark color scheme, or we can tell it that both exist and it should respect the choice that the user has selected on their computer. You can also override that altogether and say that this should only ever be this thing. We don't care what the user's settings are. But I would love it if somebody could tell me a particular use case for where that is a valid choice, because there would be accessibility concerns there. We then have a CSS color function called light dark, where I can pass in. Can anybody have a guess? If I have a CSS color function that I pass in two values, what's the first one going to be? A light color. What's the second going to be? Probably a dark color. We can pass in two colors. This is the light version, this is the dark version, depending on the color scheme. Pick one. So rather than having to go through and write separate CSS for separate themes, we can do it all in one go. And that will then give us sections. The first one has a dark color scheme. The second one has a light color scheme. The third one is picking up what my computer has said. And the final one respects the toggle that we have on the page. And so I can go through and change them based on the colors that I've already set. So that's pretty cool. Next, vertically centering things. How do we vertically center things? Someone tell me, if you had to vertically center content inside of a box, what's the first thing you'd reach for? Suffering, hard coding the size to be exactly what we were after. Can someone who is not a speaker in the front row answer this question, please? Sorry? Image map. Can someone who is not a speaker at all, not just necessarily if you're in the front row. Flexbox, this is when we use Flexbox. So our favorite thing about Flexbox is we can go through and we can vertically center things. I know there's probably some people in the room who would say that they'd prefer to just turn the thing into a table and then they can use that. But I'm also aware of the fact that they would say that only because they know that it would bug me. They're the same people who like to comment on my CSS grid talk and say, I don't need grid, it's just fancy tables. I have two boxes here. Both of these have vertically centered content. One using an old method, Flexbox, and one using a new method. We have our Flexbox, display flex, a line item center. We'd probably have to do a few other things because Flexbox does change the way the layout works. But now, we can use the align content property, which we've already had available for Flexbox and CSS Grid. This is now effective on any items that have display block. So now if I want to vertically center something, I can just set align content center, and it will vertically center it. I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to mess around with it. It's just there. Wow. That's the thing you were excited about, vertically centering? I've built some really cool demos and I was excited about the theme toggle, but just vertically centering things. Could I have gotten up and just shown that script and left? Vertically centering, that's all we need to know. I'm done. Excellent. It's fine, we can go out and get some food early if we're going to finish up quickly. Next, I want to look at CSS Grid. Now, CSS Grid doesn't necessarily meet my criteria of having come out since March of 2020 because it came out beforehand. Now, I know it definitely came out beforehand because I spent most of 2019 traveling the world and talking about CSS Grid. But I want to talk about subgrid, which was a shiny new thing that we kind of said would make things easier, but we didn't have available then. This is now available in all browsers, and this allows us to inherit a parent grid, and in particular, a parent grid's columns and rows. So here I have, and for anybody that's feeling exhausted and kind of struggling to follow along with code samples, I promise at the end, when my computer is able to connect to the internet again, I will publish the links to live versions of the code samples so you can check my work and make sure that I wasn't lying to you and just making this all up. I can go through and define a parent grid, and I can then inherit the rows of that parent grid from my cards. Now, this is really useful for being able to go through and making sure that each of my cards will line up exactly. Who here has tried to put together a grid layout like this and had the design team come back and go, well, we really want the titles to all align next to one another so that the tags all align next to one another. But the problem is that one of the cards has a title that's a single word long, and the other one has a title that's 4 lines long. Who here has tried to build that? Or pushed back and said, no, we can't do that? Does not need JavaScript. Does not need JavaScript. If you think it needs JavaScript, I refer you to my talk from Copenhagen last year. Your website does not need JavaScript. So we can go through and inherit our CSS grid layout from any grid children so that things will continue to line up. Now, we can do this on a column level or a row level or both, but this gives us a lot more ability to make sure that things line up nicely. Talking about code is definitely taking way less time than writing code. So we are going to get to do quite a few more demos today. And And my super exciting thing that I was going to save to the end, we get to do now. Who here actually read the abstract for this talk? I promise I won't get upset if you didn't. I will literally turn up to a talk if I think the title sounds interesting. I want to draw your attention to the bottom of my abstract where I said, disclaimer, you still need a library to style a select field, sorry. Pretty much everything is possible now. So, turns out I lied. Didn't know it at the time, but I lied. Sorry to the agenda committee, I didn't know that I lied. Because we can do this now. We now have available the select list element and the list box element, which allow us to go through and build a more UI-intensive select field. Functional form element, functional form input. We can go through and style each of the elements inside of the select list with CSS. These are all available. There's no shadow DOM. There's no things that just can't be touched. Every property, even the browser default styling available to it, can still be customized with our own CSS. So we could go through and do that. That means I can go through and build a really nice interactive select field with images, or I can go through and build a little context menu or choose an action. I can add images and icons, and I can style it the exact way I want to. I can go through and add SVGs, add extra items to them. I can go through and add images and display the selected option in the form so that the user gets the same thing they did when picking it. So we can go through and do this now. This is super duper exciting, and I got really excited to go through and use this. Anybody already heard of the select list element and know what my next thing is? Lemon, for anybody who missed his talk on CSS earlier this week. Lemon knows the answer to this. So I haven't talked about the really important thing yet with some of this stuff, which is browser support. Most of this stuff is pretty good. So the pseudo-selectors we looked at, they've got fairly solid browser support. Has is the newest one, and it's been out in Firefox since 2023. The rest have been around for quite a while. The color scheme and light-dark mode has been in Firefox since 2023. The rest of them available this year. When I say the rest of them as well, I mean Firefox, Edge, and Chrome. Can send you full browser details lists if there was anything else you wanted. Vertically aligning. As I said, this property we've already had with CSS Grid for quite a while, but it has been able to be used for display block since this year. Does have full browser support, just very, very new. What else do we look at? Subgrid has been available for quite a while. Firefox and Safari have had it since the before times, and Chrome and Edge have had it since 2023. CSS nesting has had full support since last year, so that one's pretty good. Select list and list box, our stylable selects. That one is available in all Chromium browsers since now, this year, a couple of months ago, and it's still behind a feature flag. But it's happening. There's some stuff that we're able to go through and do. Now, if my internet is working, we're going to see anybody here heard of container queries? A couple of people? All right, we're going to go through and try and do some container queries, if this will let me. While I'm getting this up, does anybody have any questions about CSS or new things in CSS they'd like to know more about? Can I think of a use case for is? Amazing, thank you. I have, with this, if you're not using CSS nesting, is does make it a little bit easier to write CSS selectors where multiple elements could be addressed. So say, for example, if I wanted to get a list inside of a div, but it could be an ordered list or it could be an unordered list, I can go through and get either of them at once. And that does make it a little bit easier, but I've not come across too many other use cases. I have seen quite a lot of CSS frameworks and UI frameworks starting to use it in some of their styling and the way they compile that. My issue with that is it's often being interpreted differently to how we assume our CSS that we write is being interpreted, and because there's less browser support. So I've had some issues with Astro. I love Astro. I love using Astro, which is a static site generator, if anybody hasn't heard of it or used it before. And I found they started using some of the pseudo-selectors before they were available in Firefox, and that caused a few issues, which was a little bit annoying. They did thankfully have the ability to go through and turn it off, but yeah, it's worked kind of differently, and most of the time that I've seen it used and used it, I've actually not liked the way that's working. But I would love to see a use case for when it does make things easier. Sorry, I'm just trying to connect to the hotspot I've been handed, but it's not, no, found it. Yeah. Anybody else have a CSS question while I'm getting this set up?
So you showed an example with a validation on a checkbox.
Yes.
Is there any way in CSS of not showing that until they've tried to submit the form yet?
Showing validation on a checkbox, but not until somebody's actually tried to submit the form. Not necessarily with that use case, I don't think. I'd have to play around with it a little bit. But we do have another new CSS thing, which now that I have CodePen up and we can write some live stuff, we do have some new pseudo-classes. I think they're pseudo-classes. So if I have an input, wait, I'm typing HTML here. If I have an input of type text, and I'm going to set this to be required. Now, there is a pseudo-class of valid and invalid. There's a pseudo-class of valid and invalid. And so we can go through and select whether or not the browser thinks the field is valid or invalid. Now, depending on the type of field you're using, for example, if you are using email field, it does do a little bit of browser side, not necessarily validation, but checking. It will look and make sure that there's at the very least an @ symbol in your input. If there's no @ symbol, it can't be an email address. You can set a certain type of pattern. For example, for telephone numbers, you can expect to get it in a certain format, and the browser will go through and make sure that it meets that format. So we can check, is it valid or is it invalid? And so this is really useful to be able to then go through and style it without having to add our classes or do too much error checking. The problem with that is, though, so this is a required field, and this is going to yell at me with its big red border because this is a required field, and I haven't filled it in yet. But I haven't done anything with it yet. I'm not trying to submit the form. I've literally just loaded the page up, and it's already yelling at me. Who here's tried to submit a form, and immediately it starts yelling at you that you haven't filled in a required form? Yeah. I know, just give me a chance. You've got 15 fields on the page. Give me an opportunity to go through and start doing something with it. So we have valid and invalid. We now also have user valid and user invalid. So this will go through and make sure it won't tell me that the field is invalid until I've actually started to do something with it or tried to submit the form. So in this case, so say for example, I had an email field. I want to go through and type something in this. This will tell me, I'm going to zoom in a bit as well. This will go through and tell me that this is invalid because this is an email input. It's expecting an email. And I've done something. I've put something in the field, but it's not valid. But it will actually wait for me to go through and start doing something with the field before it gets upset about it. So then if I go through and write real email at add, browser validation isn't perfect when it comes to, is this a legitimate email address? However, I do prefer this to places like, not going to mention the streaming service that also has a whole bunch of theme parks all over the world, and it's been in the news a little bit at the moment, that won't let me sign up for an account, which apparently is a good thing now, and I should be okay with this because I can sue them for something completely unrelated. But they won't let me sign up for an account because it considers my custom email addresses invalid. I have several custom email addresses at .dev, .design, and .au domains. These are all valid. They work for a whole bunch of places, but they won't let me sign up for streaming services because they have very strict email validation. So there's probably something between has an @ symbol and we think this is right, but we can go through and use that. Yes, there was a question down the front. Does the validation get checked on focus or when you start typing? Yeah, so would it start to yell at me if I've started typing but haven't put the @ symbol in yet? So that seems to be okay. If I click away from the field and I don't have an @ symbol, then it will get upset about it. But then as soon as I put the @ symbol in, it will go through and start using that again. So these are two. So we have user invalid and user valid. The question about focus leads me to another new pseudo-selector. Anybody familiar with what focus styles are? I told you I'm expecting everyone to fall asleep in the after lunch talk, so when I try and get you to raise your hands, I'm checking how many people are still awake. Focus styles are typically used for people who are navigating around with a keyboard. So I can go through, and if I use tab and my arrow keys to navigate around, my focus styles will tell me what interactive element I'm currently selecting. That's probably a button or a link or a form input. But a lot of the time, the focus styles will also pick up if we have clicked on something or interacted with it with our mouse. Now, I've never been too fussed on this one. However, I have worked on quite a few projects where the designers and the clients have picked up that when I click on a navigation menu item, For the 2 seconds it takes before it redirects to another page, the focus styles are visible. I think they're also mildly objecting to the fact that I will only use obvious focus styles, still on brand, but the idea of focus styles is that they shouldn't be able to be missed. What we can instead use, so I can say input, focus, this is where we often have outline, 2px, dotted, chartreuse, because I like chartreuse. And now I have, actually no, that's not great with background. Goldenrod. That's worse. Purple. Now I have a focus style. While I'm focused on this input, I can see that this is the input that I'm focused on. I have my outline. But what I could instead use is focused visible. And this is where I'm going to realize that an input is a horrible example for this, because it's always going to be keyboard focus. And I should use a button. So if I have a button, I have focus styles, I click me, I get my output, I get my outline. And if I have focus visible, when I click, I won't get the outline. But if I'm navigating around with my keyboard, it will still respect the focus styles. So we can still make sure we include them, but they are available to users who are using keyboard for navigation rather than users who are using their mouse or another kind of pointer device. This is really great for making sure that we're respecting any design choices or client preferences, whilst also ensuring that we're taking into consideration accessibility and people who are using websites differently to how we might expect. Main concern with this one is if a browser doesn't support focus visible. This one has fairly excellent browser support. However, a lot of the time assistive technologies have less browser support, and people might be using older browsers for various reasons, or I don't know, I've not actually checked the browser support of like a Samsung fridge or something like that. I'm going to expect that probably doesn't have what I'm used to. So what I can instead do is take advantage of my fancy new pseudo-selectors, and I can check if the button is being focused, but if it's not focus visible, so this is the not selector we talked about briefly, then I can turn the outline off. Wait, I have to change this back to be focus. So by default, I still have focus styles. I know there's good browser support on that one. I know that these are still available if anybody's navigating around with their keyboard. I know if anybody's using an old browser, they will still continue to see the focus styles, but if the browser is able to A, pick up the not selector, and B, pick up the focus visible selector, I know that it's going to use the newer version instead. The great thing about the not selector and the focus visible selector, if the browser doesn't know what to do with them, it's going to ignore it. If I was a little bit concerned about whether or not it would ignore it when I was expecting it to, I can use a supports query instead. All right. Anybody else have any questions about the form inputs? Nope. Okay. We're going to see if we can load my live demos. That I was playing around, and this is I decided to try using code spaces because there's a whole bunch of GitHub people at these conferences banging on about code spaces and how amazing it is to be able to you don't have to set up your machine and you can just do it all in the cloud and this is really great. And then the internet went down. And now my code space has gone to sleep, so it's having to start up again. While that's starting up, very much appreciate everyone's patience here today as well. While that's starting up, did anybody else have any questions about CSS or new CSS? Any rumors or fancy new things they've heard of that I haven't talked about? So I will share at the end. There is a very, very long list. I went through and had a look at everything that's been released in the last few years to see what new stuff I should talk about. And there was a lot more than I thought there was. Like a lot more. I expected to find, maybe 5 to 10, maybe 20 different things that I could potentially talk about. And I've filled about 4 pages of notes of new things to look into. So I will share a whole bunch more demos afterwards. Do I have opinions on text wrap pretty? I have an opinion that it is cool. Let's have a look at that one for those who are not familiar with it. So here I have a div, and inside of my div I have a heading. This is a really, really long heading. A div, I'm going to set a maximum width of 500 pixels for now. I'm going to set a background so I know that we'll be able to see it. And a little bit of padding, so it just looks a little bit nicer. So I have a really, really long heading. Now I know that this heading is going to go through and wrap because it's too big to fit in the field. However, we don't necessarily know how long this heading is going to be. We don't know how wide its container is going to be, and so we don't necessarily know how the heading is going to wrap. Anybody here worked on a UI component at all where the design team or the marketing team have specified where a heading should break so that it looks nicely? Quite a few? Yeah. It's a common thing. For the record, if there are any designers in the audience that feel like I don't like you, that is absolutely not the case. I love working with designers because you all do amazing things that I couldn't do. I can build whatever it is that you create, but I can't. I can make things not look obnoxious. The green and purple and obnoxious yellow that I use in my demos is just for fun. I'm aware of the fact that that doesn't look nice, and I can make it look not obnoxious, but you do a fantastic job otherwise. So text wrap pretty allows us to make the wrapping work a little bit nicer. So in cases where we have one lonely word, we're able to go through and get it to balance things out a little bit more. So this has a couple of different options. Text wrap balance has been around for a while, and that will go through and balance so each line will be as close to the same length as possible. A lot of the time, we'll go through and that is what we're after. So this will make sure that it's kind of balanced and we don't have one really long line and the rest will be a bit different. Whereas pretty, this one works the same, but starts to take performance into consideration a little bit. So this one gets a little bit funky. Most of the time I've used it, I've played around between them, and I don't know if I would have a particular favorite or a particular preference in how I'm using it. It's just a case of this one starts to look good. That make sense? I'm going to hazard a guess. You have a strong opinion on it, on text wrap pretty? Yes. So if anyone would like to know more, Lemon has a very strong opinion, and I'm sure would be happy to discuss it with you afterwards. All right, has my demo spun up? We have the internet. So this one I'm super excited about because this is container queries. Anybody here heard of container queries? Anybody here familiar with media queries? It's responsive web design. Depending on the size of the screen, we can change the way things are laid out. But this will then work based on the screen size. And most of the time, this is fine. We know that when we're on mobile screen size, we want, say, for example, our cards to lay out a different way. And then when we go to a different screen size, we want it to get laid out a different way as well, and so on and so forth. But then we got the ability to use things like Flexbox and Grid. And these are really great, and I can share a couple of talks that go into these a lot more for you later. Some of them aren't my talks as well. Some of them are other people's talks. If you're not familiar with Grid, I recommend checking it out. It allows us to create more responsive layouts, more responsive designs without necessarily having to write a whole bunch of media queries. For a lot of my card feeds and things like that, I don't actually have to write different sizes. I write one line and it will work out, the browser will work out itself based on the screen size, what the layout should look like. What that means is I don't actually go through and check whether or not I'm expecting a card to be a certain size or a certain width. I let the browser work that out. And if my demo is going to work, this should hopefully show this. If this is building. Nope. What is this not getting? What this means is container queries, which if anybody wants to know more about, I'll show you the code samples afterwards. And as I said, I will, once I can upload these, I will share them as well. Similar to media queries, we can go through and check the size of the screen. Is the screen 200 pixels wide, 300 pixels wide, 5,000 pixels wide? We can go through and check if a particular container, if a particular element is a certain size, and we can then go through and go, well, if this element is at least 300 pixels wide, I want it to be laid out this way. If it's at least 400 pixels wide, I want it to be laid out this way. We can go through and rearrange based on the element itself rather than having to infer what we think it will be based on a certain screen size. So this makes it way easier so we can go through and yeah, my code spaces still won't sort it. I'm going to go back to local development after this because this is not working. Like, we're able to go through and work this out and go from there. Container queries also give us access to some extra CSS units as well. So similar to, we already have viewport units, viewport width, viewport heights. We have a whole bunch of container query units that we're able to go through and use as well. And this is going to be really exciting when we can start to use this, because although a lot of the time we can use percentages or we can lay it out the way a grid works and have it size implicitly, this will give us a lot more control over how we're able to go through and do it. And yeah, now my code space is offline again. Container queries have fairly decent browser support as well. These have been around since 2022. Firefox 2023, and the new units have been around for the same amount of time as well. So I forgot to talk about CSS nesting as well. CSS nesting has been available in all browsers since, I think it was early last year. So these are getting fairly decent support as well. I want to thank you all so much for your patience with our interesting, partially interactive demo talk here today, and very much thank you to the absolutely not planted speakers in the front row and asking questions to make you all feel a little bit more comfortable. As I said, I promise I will upload all of this code, all of these examples and the slides, and I will post it out on Discord and on the various social media platforms, not Facebook, but Twitter and Mastodon and Blue Sky and LinkedIn, and did I miss one? No, I'm not putting it on Threads. I'm not putting it on TikTok. I'm not putting it on Snapchat. I will put it on the important social media platforms that I like, and Discord, so you can all have access to that. I am also going to be around for the rest of the conference as well, you know, all 3-4 hours of it. If you would like to have a look at the code locally on my computer, it works on my machine, right? If you would like to have a look at the code or ask me any more questions, and I will be sharing a blog post with all of these examples and a whole bunch more at some point in the next few weeks too. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I hope you've all enjoyed your post-lunch nap session and are now energized for the rest of the afternoon, for the rest of the conference. You can all go and tell those speakers that the reason you have so much energy for their talks is because I let everybody nap in mine. So thank you very much. Go and enjoy the food.